a good way to understand at least one dimension of geopolitics is to understand that control over energy resources means control over the flow of financial markets as well as access to liquidity. I want to start and frame today's discussion by saying that I've dedicated the next at least 10 years of my life to developing and deploying solar at the building and utility scale, both here in the United States as well as in Africa. Now, I want to say that because in today's discussion, I want to focus on the overpromise or the false promises of renewable energy. And I want to lead this discussion with a lot of the talking points that are pretty common among environmental justice advocates and advocates of clean energy in general. And I want to make it clear that I'm not saying it from the standpoint of somebody who naysays those technology. In fact, I breathe every single day in solar energy. I also want to be very clear and mindful of the fact that every single country has its own idiosyncrasies, if you will. They have their own peculiarities that make deploying solar or deploying an energy grid very much dependent on the local circumstances. Every country has its own unique combination of geography, geology, climate, natural resources, and culture that makes it impossible to apply a blanket or cookie cutter policy approach or energy deployment approach for any given purpose. And especially something as important as ensuring the adoption of energy security or adoption of protocols that protect and provide some reasonable and adequate defense against the impacts of climate change. To that end, the realist in me wants to temper expectation of what the actual benefits are that renewables can bring to the table. These are benefits that are going to vary by region. They're going to vary by the kind of economic or infrastructure development that's on the table, as well as the overall level of economic development that's already in place. Renewables and Green New Deals, as they say in the United States, are often touted as some kind of magic bullet or some kind of cure-all for a wide range of issues that are relevant to either energy security or to climate change. But in actual practice, and I'm speaking as someone again who's on the front lines actually developing solar, is that renewables present their own challenges, both from a financial perspective, both from a geopolitical perspective, as well as from a basic commodity availability supply chain perspective. So first, what I want to do is start by looking at some of the most common myths that are pervasive within the climate justice or the environmental justice spaces. And these are myths that are frequently propagated by green advocates and those that have a strong focus on ecological justice. And again, this is not a criticism of those particular movements. I think that there's an incredible amount of value in those particular spaces, especially as we see how slowly governments are actually responding to the incipient and rising threat of global climate change crisis, right? So, but to that end, I think it's also important for us to have a very clear understanding of what's real and what is more politicized talk. So there are 5 myths in particular that I want to focus on for today's discussion. The first one is the idea that renewables will save the planet. Now, I'm one that tends to take political slogans at face value. I don't think that there's too much value in really reading into subtext of a message. And I think that if a political message requires subtext, it's generally a poor slogan. So in the case of renewables will save the planet, I think one thing to really understand about saving the planet is that if the worst case of anthropogenic climate change were to happen, right? If we were to see an average temperature rise of 3 degrees Celsius or more per year, the planet would still survive. Humanity is what is at risk, right? Climate change represents an existential threat to humanity. And to be frank, not even to humanity's overall existence, but certainly to the existence of these civilizational structures that we have in place today, right? I think that would drive a tremendous amount of social upheaval, a tremendous amount of migration crisis, and we're already seeing it right now. And these migration crises will bring their own political crises as the conflict over resources internally, the conflict over political entitlements, access to healthcare system that had traditionally been allocated just for natives. Those are the kinds of things that climate change and the most severe cases of climate change are going to bring to the fore and cause some significant civilizational collapse. But to be very clear, though, we're not actually saving the planet, right? This is a planet that's been around for 4 billion years, right? Multicellular life has been around for less than a billion years. So less than a quarter of Earth's entire history have we even seen multicellular organisms, right? Um, Even if the worst cases of climate change were to happen, even if I understate, and even if my projection of in the worst case scenarios of climate change, there'll still be humans surviving, but certainly not in the level of comfort that people in first world countries today are generally enjoying. Let's say that humanity entirely is wiped out, right? We're still going to see single-celled organisms, cyanobacteria, etc., continue to thrive. And in fact, if you look at the era of dinosaurs, or you look at the era, hundreds of millions of years ago, right? There were periods of time when the average temperatures of the Earth were high enough where there were no ice caps, so there was no ice at the poles. You look at the era in which cyanobacteria and photosynthesis first became that evolutionary uplift and caused a mass extinction. I think we're going to see similar things where you're going to see photosynthetic types of organisms actually thrive in conditions where Earth becomes the hothouse scenario that is projected in some of those worst case scenarios. That may be of little comfort to those who are specifically concerned about humanity. But what is at stake here is not the survival of life on the planet, but more specifically, it's the survival of first world life as we know it. It really does drive the politics of what climate change accords and what reduction accords are really looking to preserve politically, culturally, institutionally. And that should give us a better sense of, from a policy perspective, what are even the entire societal structures that we want to have 30, 40, 50 years from now. Certainly, life as it is right now cannot continue. I think if we were to talk a lot about some additional theories, for example, the overshoot theory, where climate change is not the central focus. Climate change, anthropogenic climate change, is in fact a consequence or a symptom of a deeper problem, which is that our overall ecological footprint is greater than what our environment can actually sustain for us. So again, going back to this myth, renewables will save the planet. No, no. If anything, renewables are still part of the problem because you can't recycle solar panels, right? There are no robust processes for reusing the materials that go into that. We still have to use an incredible amount of fossil fuels to even create the panels. The chemical and industrial processes that are part of the supply chain, and we'll get into that shortly, use quite a bit of fossil fuels in order to be able to generate these components that are then used for wind turbines or for solar energy. Okay, so myth number 2, renewables will guarantee world peace, right? The underlying assumption behind this myth is that oil or crude oil and control of trade of said is the primary driver of global conflict. Now, it is true that control over oil and control over energy has been a constant source of conflict within the world for the last 150 to 200 years. It has definitely been a major source of global conflict and a major source of imperial conflict as well. If you look at both World War I and World War II, some of the core economic drivers of those wars had to do with control over energy sources, particularly crude oil. But that being said, again, the fight for control is over energy sources. It's not specifically over oil, because at the end of the day, the crux is control over energy. The reason why it's a control over energy is because there's a very close relationship between economic growth and energy availability, right? So if you can control energy, you control the economic trajectory of a community, of a city, of a country. I think it's important to just understand that we will continue to have global conflicts. We will continue to have aspiring hegemons, either from the West or outside of the West. We will still have aspiring hegemons attempt to control the face of economic development across entire regions based on control of the commodity supply chains that underpin the next big energy source. So if it is solar and wind turbines, right, we're going to see wars over control over the commodity supply chains for things like polysilicon, for things like iron, steel, all the components that go into making the the actual structures, the actual energy generation for renewables. Number 3, energy sourcing is all or nothing. In other words, we need 100% divestment from fossil fuels. Now, there are a couple of reasons why this is a myth or this is a fallacy. Number one, I discussed earlier, which is that the underlying problem that we're facing is not actually emission reduction or the need for emission reduction. The underlying problem is overshoot. The underlying problem is that we simply, as a society, consume too much. The access to electricity or the access to energy allows us to create more processes to consume more faster. I mean, if you look at the trajectory of labor productivity over the last 100 years, right, it is an exponential growth in terms of the increase in productivity with the same level of electricity inputs. In other words, we are extracting more and more and more for every kilowatt hour of electricity that we consume. Right. So to that end, 100% renewables does not solve our problem. 100% renewables simply means that we have transitioned from a more CO2 emitting energy source to one that doesn't emit as much CO2 at the point of actual energy generation or electricity generation. But in terms of the activities that it fuels, these are still highly consumptive activities. I mean, we still have, we want to get into, again, the supply chains to fulfill the consumer culture that we have, the incredible amount of food waste that we have, all sorts of industrial processes, right? If we don't actually change the structure of how those things work, right, we're simply trading the source of electricity. And while the source of electricity does not emit as much CO2, we simply push all those emissions upstream into the actual back end production process to actually create the inputs that are used by these renewable energy sources. Myth number 4, nuclear energy is off the table. It shouldn't be, right? Robust energy systems, robust energy portfolios have a diverse set of energy sources that are available to the user or to the grid system. And this is for obvious reasons, right? Because if you have a disruption in your supply chain for your solar panels, you have a disruption in your supply chain for natural gas, you have a disruption in your supply chain for uranium or whatever other input materials are necessary to generate the energy that you use, that cripples one section of your grid. Or if it doesn't cripple one section of your grid, it causes electricity prices to skyrocket. So in order to provide security, in order to provide energy security, and energy security is not just access and availability of energy, but it's also the predictability and the stability of electricity prices by your end users, both your industrial commercial end users as well as your residential end users. You need to have a very diverse portfolio. Just like when you look at it from an investment perspective, or when you look at it in terms of where you allocate the capital that you have available to you, right? You diversify where you put your capital. You diversify the assets in which you invest, because that allows you to spread your risk across your portfolio so that you have a level of downside protection. So if you have downtime in one commodity or one downtime in one energy source, you can fail over to others without significant disruption in whatever it is, whatever activities you're using the electricity that you're generating for. Myth number 5. It is possible to divest from fossil fuels and still maintain Western hegemony over the global diplomatic and financial system. I ended on this particular myth because I think this is the myth that underpins a lot of the other myths that I discussed, right? Where essentially we're still trying to, we recognize that we need to make a fundamental shift in how we behave from an economic and consumptive standpoint. But we're trying to make that shift and still maintain Western hegemony and political economic control over activities within the rest of the world. Now, this just isn't possible. And again, once we dive a little bit deeper into commodity supply chains, we'll see why this is a misconception that I think is not only going to lead us to a dangerous path from a diplomatic or geopolitical perspective, but it's just not viable, is not realistic, and frankly, I don't even know if it is desirable at the end of the day. And the reason why I don't think that it is desirable, even from a Western perspective, is that if we look at the number of countries that the United States has placed on sanctions, whether they are blanket sanctions across the entire country like Cuba or Iran, or targeted sanctions like in Zimbabwe or in Venezuela, for example, the fundamental purpose of sanctions, at least what has been disclosed to the public as the rationale, has been an attempt to separate the political leadership from the public. In other words, you make the public suffer enough that they, in theory, rise up and overthrow that old government and replace them with one that is more pro-Western or friendly to the United States. And if we just ignoring the obvious conflict in political philosophies that presents. In other words, Western liberal philosophy is very heavy on sovereignty and self-determinations, and we're essentially promoting a philosophy that denies countries the right to do so. But ignoring that moral quandary aside, the reason why that's not attractive and the reason why that's not an approach that is desirable is because it has never worked, right? There has not been a single country that the United States has placed sanction on that has actually accomplished that stated goal of removal of that particular leadership for one that is more pro-Western. So because that has not worked, what effectively we have done has been to constrain the economic development available to millions of people across the planet, right? We have essentially created whole economies and even whole regions where we've fundamentally starved them of liquidity. Now, when we get to the idea, or we get to the point at which we want to then start divesting from crude oil and other fossil fuels and move into renewables, now we run into a problem because there are very high capex and startup costs related to the deployment of renewable energy. Because there are high startup costs, now financing becomes an incredibly important part of the equation. And now, if financing is no longer available because there's no liquidity, then now you've essentially handicapped these countries from being able to do two things. One, they're not able to actually provide any kind of economic development at all. And so as a result of this enforced poverty, you actually encourage and force the use of not just fossil fuels, but the dirtiest fossil fuels possible, because now you have people who are desperate and doing whatever they can to provide energy. So now they're burning wood. Now they're burning toxic waste in order to provide heat for their families. And this is economy wide. And so the level of emissions as the populations grow bigger and as urbanization takes hold, particularly in continents like Africa, you start to see higher levels of overall consumption, which then translates into higher levels of overall pollution. And now we've handicapped them, though, from the ability to access financing necessary to make that transition to more clean energy sources. So I think that's where we actually then create some significant and probably unsurmountable barriers to the ability for entire regions, which means hundreds of millions of people getting access to clean energy outside of, on their own, being able to come up with the money out of pocket, which again leads to greater stratification within these societies. So as a whole, if we want to be able to ensure that we have divestment from fossil fuels across the planet in a somewhat equitable manner, then we need to let go of the idea that the West can dictate the economic and political trajectory of the rest of the world. Because the ability to do that is there, but the ability to do that is predicated on essentially financially handicapping the countries that do not comply with this Western point of view. So now that we've examined some of the most popular misconceptions, now let's look and compare some of the commodity value chains of both oil and natural gas, as well as some of the more dominant clean energy sources such as solar and wind power. Understanding the commodity value chains, this can help us get some significant insights into the drivers of some of the state level behaviors that we see and some of the conflicts that I alluded to around, shifting from oil to clean energy, not actually addressing the underlying geopolitical tensions that will come into play. So I've spoken in other settings about the well researched and well identified relationship between GDP growth as well and electricity availability. So a good way to understand at least one dimension of geopolitics is to understand that control over energy resources means control over the flow of financial markets as well as access to liquidity. And this is going to be something that you're going to hear me say over and over again, because as complex as some of these situations are, and even as I said myself that a lot of countries, or not a lot, but every country has its own idiosyncrasies that drive some of the political development and economic development, there are still some common threads that connect and tie the behaviors of state level actors and state level politicians across the entire planet. Okay, so first let's take a look at the oil value chain. So I'll look at and frame this as 5 key steps within this value chain. So the first step is exploration. So when we say exploration, we're talking about things like um, doing initial assessment of a particular patch of land to see if it has the geological potential to have crude oil underground. And this process, this value chain that I'm talking about for oil, this also applies more or less to natural gas, because they're both essentially prospected and then exploited in the general same manner. So for either of these value chains, the first step is exploration. So you have your geological assessments to determine the depth of oil fields, the potential size, and this is all used to then make some financial modeling calculations about the cost of extracting and what is the potential downstream value that can be attained uh, from drilling for either this oil or for this particular natural gas resource. That part is important because this is a pretty massive upfront investment. Not only is there a land lease that's essential, but then you also have to provide a significant amount of equipment to actually both drill at scale, to develop at scale, and to start actually doing the shipping of your mined or your drilled oil to international markets. So that first step is key into understanding the viability of that particular oil field or gas field. So once you've done your initial geological exploration, you then move into your development and production phase where you start to design how you're actually going to do the mining. And again, this is where your financial modeling is going to come in to understand what your options are and what the cash flow and the P&L is going to look like for a mining activity for that particular field. Once that piece is completed and the prospective mine company or mining company or drilling company kind of reviews the P&L, their investment committee makes a decision about whether to move forward with the exploration, or not the exploration, but the actual drilling and production. Then you have the wheel set in motion to actually execute on the drilling, the the actual extraction of the either natural gas or oil, and then hooking it up with the supply chain to move it downstream towards the transportation and trade. At which point, then you start storage as well as sale to the international market. Now, further downstream, once you get past the point of sale, and this is where this may get blended because you may have the same company do refinement either on site or within their own network, but in a different location. But I think for the sake of simplicity, let's just say that the entity that's drilling for this resource, whether it's oil or gas, sells it in its crude form. They don't do any kind of downstream processing, but in fact, some other buyer was going to do that part. So this downstream buyer will obtain and procure the crude oil. They'll do the process and refining to make it readily available for a myriad of different uses. Creation of petrochemicals for a wide range of uses, for example, for plastics and among other things, or for use as an energy source. And then at the very downstream point of the value chain is where we actually have either the wholesale marketing and distribution to your actual end users. The end users being either commercial or industrial users. So you think factories, you think plants that need wholesale volume of energy to run on a day-to-day basis, or we're talking about grid operators or grid maintainers for their portfolio of energy sources to provide to their residential, commercial, industrial users. So what's interesting about global oil and natural gas production, and again, this gets back to understanding some of the commonalities of state level actors, is if we look at this list of the top 10 oil producing countries and the top 10 natural gas producing countries, you're going to see something interesting. You're going to see United States, number 1, and Russia, number 2. Now, there are a lot of other things that are at play within this particular conflict between Russia and Ukraine. But I think just looking at this and understanding the drivers of American foreign policy, particularly over the last 70 years, which are heavily influenced by control over the trade of crude oil around the world, we can see here that you have a proxy war, right? Because I'm convinced that this particular war is not a direct war between Russia and Ukraine, but is in fact a war between Russia and essentially the EU and US political bloc, where Russia is using its control over Europe as an export market to limit Europe's ability to act on behalf of Ukraine. Same thing for the United States. But I think fundamentally from the United States, the reason why we've seen a continuance of NATO even after the collapse of the USSR, because again, the point of NATO was to contain the USSR. The Russian Federation is a different political entity, and yet NATO persisted, right? And understanding this chart of the top 10 oil producing countries and the top 10 gas producing countries can provide some good insights into why NATO persisted, even when its theoretical mandate had expired. Let's say that we do make this shift away from crude oil and away from petrochemicals and away from fossil fuel based energy sources and move it towards clean energy sources like solar or wind. What are some of the key components that are going to be important for us to consider when we do make that transition? Well, I think the number one thing to consider are, again, the commodity supply chains. Because as I mentioned when discussing the top 5 myths about clean energy, the thing that came to mind was the fact and the idea that war is not going to end just because we stop using crude oil or just because the petrodollar is no longer the driving force of US foreign policy. We're still going to see conflicts related to global energy supply chains because that is just the inherent nature of state actors. That is just the inherent nature of those who desire power, is that those who desire power desire the ability to control the flow of financial markets, right? And where energy flows, financial markets follow. So if you want to control financial markets, you control energy flow. You control energy flow in a clean energy regime by controlling the key commodities that are used to create the tools that we use to actually extract energy from the sources, in this case, the sun or the wind. So let's start with the solar value chain. The primary piece or the primary elements of the solar value chain are essentially the production of silicon or the extraction of silicon and the production of polysilicon. Polysilicon is the primary component that's used to make the silicon wafers that go inside a photovoltaic cell. There are some other components such as glass, among other things that are also going to be necessary to make the actual solar panels, but polysilicon is the predominant and primary material that is used to make these components. We also have additional commodities like iron, steel that are used to make things like the framings for the solar panels. And these are all also going to be very important to the overall supply chain. But if we're talking purely about the materials that are used to actually extract the energy and to actually convert to electricity, we're really talking about polysilicon and its other precursors. So within this supply chain of polysilicon and other precursors, we want to look then at the primary producers of both silicon as well as polysilicon. So if we look at the leading countries of world silicon production, we see that China is by far the number one producer, right? 6 million metric tons per year produced by China. The next highest is Russia with 580. Then we follow with Brazil with 390, Norway with 350, United States with 310, France with 120, and so on. So we can see here that the vast majority of market share for raw silicon and silicon wafers are two countries that are in a political sphere that is, well, let's say, antagonistic towards the West. So this is not to say that silicon wafers, polysilicon production cannot possibly happen in Western countries. It absolutely can. I think if you look at the United States as a country, what's interesting about the United States is that, in theory, it could be a completely self-sufficient country, and it could completely abandon its attempt at global imperial control and still be a very rich country. It has that level of geological diversity and natural resource wealth. So in theory, this is not a picture of how the world will always be, right? We can change production processes, we can change industrial priorities in order to increase the amount of silicon production that actually happens, at least in the United States. But right now, status quo, the leading producers, China and Russia, are two countries that the United States does not have control over, and in fact seeks to oppose in many different ways in terms of the way that its foreign policy is shaped. And I think that's an important thing for us to understand and consider when we talk about divesting and moving towards these spaces, is that it's going to create in the short term, a higher reliance on these countries that are not aligned politically with Western geopolitical aims or goals. So I also mentioned that polysilicon is an important component, right? It's essentially the finished version or the manufactured version of the raw silicon. And again, we look at the top polysilicon manufacturers. This is for 2020. This is the most up-to-date data that I have at this point, but it has not significantly changed over the last year. We look at the top 6 providers or the top 6 manufacturers of polysilicon globally, and the vast majority are Chinese companies, right? We have one, Wacker, that is a European company. But as you can see, if you were to compare this list to 10 years ago or to 15 years ago, where the predominant polysilicon manufacturers were in fact European, we've seen a tremendous sea change in the face of global production of polysilicon. So again, these are all processes that can be wound up again. But as you can see, it took a decade for China to get into the position where it is today. And that is with all full steam ahead making that investment. In the West, as I mentioned in the last video, there is significant resistance by incumbents, particularly in the oil and gas industries, to making this shift or making this divestment. So it's going to be challenging for us to be able to actually make these changes to retake the top position in terms of the global manufacturing of polysilicon. So again, this plays a significant role in the shape of geopolitics over the next decade, over the next 2 decades, because we're in a position of dependence on supply chains that originate all the way upstream or originate in key production components in countries that are antagonistic to the West. Now, one other thing that we want to look at is the value chain for wind energy as well. Now, the value chain for wind energy is going to be a bit more varied. There are a lot more materials that go into wind. They're not singular dominant components or singular dominant materials that go into that. So they're a lot more varied. And you can see the spread of materials from some steel, cast iron, carbon fiber, copper, ferrite, brass, ceramics, concrete, etc. This range of materials, these are produced all over the world. Many of these materials, there are adequate Western suppliers, and there are some that aren't. So again, when we talk about where production happens, where assembly happens, where raw material extraction happens, you have here a value chain that is very diverse, that relies on a wide range of different countries and different source materials and different inputs within that value chain. All of those inputs create geopolitical risk. These are going to be things that are important for us to consider when we talk about what we need to do to make this divestment, and what does that mean from the standpoint of hey, is there global security now? Can we actually ensure the kind of world peace that we want with clean energy, right? And the real answer is that no, it will actually make things a lot more complicated. We have been spoiled by a certain extent by this Pax Americana, right? Where we do have a global hegemon that does have a globally expansive military and a globally expansive navy that enforces control over global trade, provides protection to global trade routes overseas, um, and limits the power of major state actors from doing things like invasions that would cause significant amounts of instability. And yes, while the United States itself perpetrates a significant amount of destabilization across the global south, the bigger picture is if we had a more balance of power type of arrangement where there was not a single major hegemon, the world that we would see is very similar to what we saw circa World War I and World War II, where you had a number of very powerful countries, but none powerful enough to put the rest in their place or to make the rest take pause about making bold, aggressive maneuvers towards other countries. In a world where we have divested from fossil fuels and where clean energy or renewables are the dominant source of energy, that type of scenario is no longer going to be in place. We're going to be in a world that is much more balanced from the standpoint of power. This is going to be one that's much more reliant on balancing dynamics as opposed to hard power that the way that the United States has operated for the last 70 years. So with that in mind, right, this promise of clean energy comes with a lot of risk, and it comes with a lot of change that's going to be necessary. And the key thing to remember is that this change is not something that's going to readily be in the control of the people that want this change to happen. Right? A lot of the folks politically who are at the forefront of green advocacy are people that are comfortably living in first world countries. These are people who can afford to put solar onto their roofs, who can afford to invest personally in alternative energy sources without it making a major disruption in their life. These are people who are advocating for changes that will not affect them, right? A reduction of CO2 is not going to affect somebody that has solar panels on their roof, who can afford to make a custom build of their home, who can afford to have geothermal in their house for heating. It's not going to affect them. It's going to affect the person sitting in Zimbabwe or the person sitting in Laos who has to make radical changes but doesn't have the infrastructure that Western countries do to readily switch over from one source to the other. If they don't have the infrastructure in place right now, they have to build it. And because they have to build it from scratch, building a fossil fuel-based infrastructure from scratch and building a clean energy infrastructure from scratch have very different costs associated with them, the latter being significantly more expensive. And again, because of geopolitical opposition to the West, they've also been handicapped financially in terms of their access to global financial markets and access to liquidity to actually finance that development. So by making these changes, not only do we still introduce a lot of destabilization, but then we also introduce balance of power dynamics. So the point that I'm trying to emphasize here is that we cannot have it both ways, right? If we want to make these changes, we're going to have to be prepared to make sacrifices to standard of living, to quality of life, the level at which we consume. And most importantly, the level of control that we exert over countries across the world. Is that a change that we in the West are willing to actually make? That's going to be the big question that defines the second half of this 21st century.